Why don't I start the conversation this way? Those of us in the space or helping companies in the space, we see two big drivers in terms of the need for companies and people to be tackling this. On one hand, you see pretty strong wins from a regulatory or compliance or legal perspective, in which of course, you had Europe pass the law years ago. There are multiple similar laws that are going in all over the world. We talked to Alistair McTaggart this morning, who was the force behind the California law. There are now 26 other states considering their own version of that, all of which are slightly different. So that's the side of the house that we've seen, that virtually every company out there is trying to find a solution to at least make sure they're compliant, the sort of you have to do it side of it. On the other side of maybe the other side or on a related side of the coin, almost every company you know is trying to think about making sure that their brand is secure, that they're doing the right thing by their customers, building trust, and that they're using their customer data and other personal data maximally, but ethically. You can ruin a brand really quickly if you don't, take care of your customers' data and really build that trust. And if you don't figure out how to connect up your data and use it ethically, responsibly, and in a secure way, you have an incredible asset in some companies that isn't really being used to solve your customers' problems. And that's really an opportunity side of the coin. And so we see privacy touching inside large enterprises or in small companies, almost every part of the company. Compliance, legal, IT, data governance, and engineering, product, all the way through. That's kind of the privacy, in our world. What we really wanted to talk about is we've seen across the community an incredible influx of capital over the last couple of years looking for technologies to really tackle this problem. So I'll start with you, Mome, and just ask, how do you and the PSP Partners team, how do you see the space? Why did you get interested in it? And why are you investing here? And then maybe I'll go around the group and ask the same question.
Sure. I think, Justin, you touched on a lot of the things that we also believe in and why we're interested in privacy around data and trust and managing that, all that information, in addition to just responding to regulations. So our investment thesis didn't start with privacy specifically, but rather data broadly. So first, if you look at just the sheer amount of data produced today, I think some sources have stated that 90% of the world's data was produced in the last 24 months and projected to grow exponentially over the next several years. So that has generated opportunities around tracking, processing, interpreting. So for example, we have one company that built technology to ingress petabytes of data up to 500 times faster than existing solutions. And we also have multiple investments in the application layer interpreting data. But underneath all of it, I would say privacy is an underlying current. And so we have a lot of conviction in both solutions such as Wirewheel that directly helps with data privacy management, or solutions that ensure data is protected for a particular use case. And as you mentioned, data privacy is more and more becoming part of an organization's overall business strategy and not only a response to the latest regulations. So the stakes are high if you didn't plan ahead and are caught flat-footed. Not only will you get fines for these regulations, but you lose the trust of your customers, and you also incur high costs trying to coordinate your workforce to respond live to these issues rather than spending time on new business. I would say both those issues, one, losing customers, and two, needing more workforce to respond to these events, directly hits your bottom line. So that's where we're interested in the space, that even whether we're investing directly in privacy solutions or other businesses, it all touches privacy and is something that our customers, or our portfolio's customers, are paying attention to.
Mome, thanks for that intro. And maybe, Andrew, I'll pivot over to you. How do you and the ForgePoint team see the space, and how is that do you have an investment thesis or something you focused on?
Well, Justin, I think first, one of the trends that we've seen is that the privacy market has really seen significant amount of demand. And what we hear talking to a number of chief privacy officers has really solidified for us a number of different themes that we've seen, investment themes that we've seen across the privacy. You mentioned that there's the regulatory tailwinds, and it's important, and I think you can quantify some of that too. And I know just in today's conversation, there was quite a bit of discussion around that. But if you think about it and step back on who these regulations touch, we're really talking about over the next few years, analysts will say about 2/3 of the world's population will be covered by some form of privacy regulation, and that whether that's personal data. And so we think about this modern digital economy now where data is, quote unquote, the new oil. And what does exactly that mean when it produces value for how many enterprises aim to do business in today's digital economy? Just look in the U.S. Today there's almost 60% of the U.S. population is covered by several different state bills. And the expectation, of course, is that we're going to see more privacy legislation on the landscape. But the other thing, too, is when businesses think about the bottom line and they think about how different compliance costs may fit into that, in some ways, not being compliant with these new pieces of legislation, can be quite costly. And we're seeing different regulatory bodies really step up enforcement. And I don't think that's a trend that we're going to see abate. And what it's meant also, too, is that it's catalyzed some of the investment in services, helping organizations think about how to build a privacy strategy, now how to actually build and automate the product and the technologies to scale across their different organizations. And so even just over the past few years, privacy services have really quadrupled, from about 4 years ago until today. And the expectation, too, is that we're going to see another multiple expansion on that. And of course, as businesses now have to realize how do they scale across the many different stakeholders, as you mentioned, Justin, whether it's just compliance and beyond that, the data teams, engineering teams. These are very difficult challenges that really beg for new technology solutions. The other thing I would point out, too, is, privacy, unlike a number of different areas, and what we're seeing in the landscape here, in many ways affects the top line as well. So, we focus a lot at ForgePoint on security. And in security, there's certain areas that are viewed as a cost center, a tax, if you will, on the rest of the organization. That's not really the case in privacy. And what I mean by that is that think about safety and security for, say, an airline. Airlines don't compete on safety, right? There's game theory out, and there's not an incentive to do that. And in the same way, companies don't really compete on cybersecurity. But we do see in many instances across certain verticals that certain organizations are also starting to differentiate and really compete as a brand based on their effectiveness on privacy, how they handle consumer data, how they build customer trust. That has become very important. And you see very large organizations really doubling down on their messaging in privacy. And it, of course, has to be backed by investment that those organizations take to really drive top line value for their shareholders and for their consumers. So, I'll pause there, but maybe you can talk a little bit later on just the amount of capital that we see pouring into this space and why we think that that's also important to catalyze some of the new investments, the new innovations that we're seeing really get funded to meet some of the demand.
That's perfect segue over to you, Aaron. What's any reactions from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what's been said is resonating with me. The way we've approached investing in privacy is actually pretty similar to how we think about cybersecurity in general, and that we view the evolution of cybersecurity markets to happen in effectively 3 phases. The first phase is really understanding the risk. The second phase is mitigating the risk. And the third phase is, well, now that the risk is mitigated, how do I actually enable new business innovation to unlock value from whatever this new threat surface may be. And so whether it's mobile, whether it's internet, you've always seen those kind of 3 phases happen where you need to understand where the risk vectors are, you need to protect against those risk vectors, And then the third is, okay, now I can actually enable my businesses to benefit from mobile, benefit from the rise of the internet, or in this case, benefit from having all this massive amount of user data in order to feed into algorithms, machine learning, so actually can drive new business use cases. And so the early days, actually what primarily drove an investment in Wirewheel was our belief that we were really in those first two stages. Enterprises today, they need to understand where the risk is, where the privacy data is, how to actually find it, and how to comply with the hundreds of privacy laws that are being rapidly passed around the world. And I think a key issue there is two things. One, there's so many different privacy laws, whether it's state by state, country by country. Organizations just don't have the sophistication to be able to understand how to comply with each one. And the second thing is there's a shortage of individuals in privacy, similar to how there's a shortage in sophisticated workers in cybersecurity. Same thing applies to privacy. And so the only way we're going to solve those two challenges, given the shortage of understanding and the shortage of talent, is with software that simplifies a lot of the knowledge and automates a lot of the compliance and functionality that you need. And so a huge driver behind Wirewheel was that it wasn't just focused on one privacy law. It wasn't focused on complying with one use case. It was really a platform approach. And that's also what we're big believers in cybersecurity. There are thousands of cybersecurity products, and companies today have vendor overload. What CIOs, chief privacy officers, are increasingly looking for are not point solutions. They're looking for solutions that can be deployed quickly and are very flexible, so they don't have to go buy a different privacy solution for every country they need to be compliant and with every use case they need to be compliant in. And so we really were looking for something that was agile, flexible, could serve multiple use cases, had a lot of the compliance knowledge actually baked in. So that's really where we've invested. We're looking for in the future, and what I'll talk about later on, is that third stage, which is now that I'm compliant, now that I understand where my data is, now that it's protected, how can I now start feeding that into machine learning, AI, and analytics while still maintaining compliance, but also enable me to benefit from all that data to build really cutting edge models that increase revenue or in customer satisfaction or decrease costs.
And that's really helpful. And then why don't we pivot over to Eric? Eric, you're seeing kind of investment across the space, privacy and cybersecurity. How do you react to those points from our?
Yeah, sure, Justin. It's interesting. As a investment banker as opposed to an investor, I have perhaps a little bit of a different lens, but I think the way that I'm seeing the landscape is quite similar to the other panelists. And by that, I mean, we obviously have a fantastic opportunity in front of us. It feels quite like an early opportunity still. I would liken it to where we were in cybersecurity, maybe even a decade ago. And by that, I mean, I think we've reached that stage where we recognize a huge challenge in front of us. You think about consumers demanding greater privacy. You think of the tremendous friction that all the privacy regulations create. Obviously, this creates a huge addressable market. But I still think that we're quite early on the maturity curve, and by extension, on the uptake cycle. I'll give one example. There was a 451 research survey that came out maybe a few months ago, and they noted that 81% of consumers are concerned about privacy. So obviously a huge recognition and huge uptake there. But less than 10% of organizations today have dedicated privacy teams. They're still often managing it through either IT teams or perhaps security teams. And so, there's a tremendous opportunity for growing this market, which today is quite greenfield, right? So these entrants that are today getting the financing and the investment from parties like you see with me on the panel, they don't have to go in and displace incumbents, but rather they're displacing IT teams in the back office with Excel spreadsheets. Oftentimes when I talk to vendors and I ask, who do you see in competitive bake-offs? Maybe they name one other vendor, but oftentimes they say, look, I'm going in there and I'm trying to convince them that by spending, X thousand a year with me, it's more efficient than just having the team that currently does it today on Excel and by hand. And that really shows that there's a tremendous need for innovation and I think disruption in the market. So that's why we're seeing all this investment. Clearly, OneTrust, Big ID, those are companies that now have been valued north of $1 billion. Wirewheel, the capabilities that you bring with much more conservative capitalization is quite impressive. So I don't expect that trend to end anytime soon. What's interesting, where I think we're going to see a lot of opportunity on the horizon, is really on the M&A side. So we've seen a lot of investment, but comparatively light M&A, especially in the context of what we're seeing in the security landscape. And so I think we'll see M&A in a couple of different ways going forward within privacy. One is traditional cybersecurity vendors, enterprise cyber companies, and in particular, data security or data management vendors moving into privacy, but then also some of the larger privacy vendors looking to accessorize and build out that platform, as Andrew, Aaron, and Monet also spoke about. So I think we'll see a lot of opportunity there, and ultimately, I think a lot of very successful exits for these early investors.
Well, that's so. Any reaction from anybody to Eric before we jump? Andrew, Monet, so far.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Eric that I also think we're kind of at the earlier stages of the maturity cycle, and I think investments in this space will only increase over time. Because I think as you look at a lot of the emerging sectors, the early years, a lot of money is wasted because organizations actually don't know what they're looking for. They don't know where their own data is. They don't know what their policy on privacy is. They don't know who the champion is. So you oftentimes have entire Series A rounds wasted on 2 pilots where organizations catch up. And we've seen this in other industries, healthcare, real estate, fintech. And so when the industry starts to mature, that's when investors also recognize that they don't have to do a lot of the evangelical sales. There's a lot of more positive, scalable dynamics that these companies can now capitalize on. And I think that's when we'll enter a really exciting phase in privacy over the next few years.
Terrific. Well, so then why don't we pull on a few of the strings that came up? Obviously, there's a lot of different kinds of technologies that you can bring to, for example, Aaron, the 3 phases that you talked about. So, our community, Aaron, tends to be IT professionals, of course, privacy professionals, folks who are in the security space, general counsels, lawyers who are helping their companies drive investment. We often have, law school students and professors. So from all of your perspectives, what are some of the more exciting privacy technology types or innovations you're seeing that could come around the corner? And Aaron, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the exciting things are threefold. One is things related to encryption, especially around multi-party encryption and homomorphic encryption. These are basically ways that you can encrypt data and still compute on it without actually exposing the data to a third party, such as whoever owns the hardware that's doing the computation. Another part of this is actually hardware level encryption, which is done with an emerging technology known as a secure compute enclaves. This enables you to compute on data within a special part of a chip that the rest of the chip actually can't get access to. And so you can do advanced machine learning and other analytics on sensitive data, knowing provably that the data can't escape to the other part of the chip. So you know that if this data is being computed on an Amazon or a third party, you know that the owner of that chip can't actually see it. Another way to tackle this computing on sensitive data is actually through software. And a pretty interesting area related to that is in the differential privacy space. This is effectively introducing some noise to a data set that obfuscates the data at an individual level. So you can run queries on the data, you can build machine learning models, but no matter how you slice and dice the data, there's no way for you to actually leak information so you can zero in and discover something about an individual. And so this enables you to take a large data set and start applying machine learning. Could be machine learning for healthcare, could be machine learning for building credit models, could be to machine learning for understanding customer journeys. You can start to apply this on super sensitive data, knowing that you're not actually provably violating any privacy issues. And so this is all early stage technology. I think it's being proven out and how you scale it and some of the different use cases. But if I have to think about where the innovation is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be on adoption of these technologies so that we no longer look at sensitive data just as a cost. We actually see it as a way to unlock innovation and drive business value.
Andrew, any reactions from your perspective?
Yeah, that last point that Aaron mentioned, how do you actually unlock and drive business value? That's something that becomes very important as we're seeing this this entire market just evolve. Certainly WireWheel has been at the forefront in phase 1 and phase 2, as Aaron had defined them, both establishing and maintaining understanding of privacy operations and where data is and how to actually maintain compliance. You know, what we see is the landscape evolving too, where practitioners in, say, different verticals, whether it's healthcare, financial services, you name it, they have these challenges now where how they not only handle data, but gain insights from data is what is driving increased business value. And so that's what's really driving these additional techniques that Aaron had described beyond the lab, beyond the academic environment, and actually now into real production environments. And we have seen this shift over the last 2 years in particular, where there's a healthcare company that says, look, I need to understand what's happening in patient data, but of course, given the regulations, how can we use different either secure multi-party compute or homomorphic encryption, different techniques to really gain insights on the data that they do have, or in some ways access insights from other sets of data. There have been a number of different techniques, and whether we're talking about differential privacy and federated learning, what that means, and the secure enclave idea is certainly something that's has seen quite a bit of funding recently as well. But even when you think about just the landscape of secure multi-party compute or others, I mean, we have seen just a plethora of financings in the space. To give you a sense, there's a lot of now new entrants starting to form up in this category. But when you back up, we're still starting to see, additional rounds for companies that are scaling quite a bit. If you take a look at all the privacy financings just in the first half of this year, here we are at the end of H1, and there's been, I believe it's close to $10 billion in all sorts of loosely affiliated privacy technologies. When you narrow that down and then look at the amount of investment dollars that have flowed into the space over the past few years, we're seeing not only deal activity, but deal volume increase by over 25% year on year. And it's trying to keep pace with the market pool that we're seeing for these different techniques to allow organizations really to gain value, business value off of the data that they have.
One reaction I have before I turn to Mome and Eric is we've seen a similar trend, and we see in companies quite a bit, especially larger enterprises, the establishment of a data governance layer or a data governance set of practices or data governance technologies. So, Mome, Andrew, Aaron, Eric, I mean, to your point, there's a large investment that has already been made and that is going on in the space in metadata management, for example, master data management, customer data platforms. These are all areas in which companies are trying to get a handle on what is my data, and with a specific segment of that data, for example, customer data, have a deep understanding of it in relation to different vectors and the ability to sort of enrich it with other data sources or re-identification. That's a broad investment we're seeing a lot of companies make. A key thing here about it, though, is that in order to maximally use your data, so if you know your data, that's one major thing. That's a critical thing. But Aaron, to your point, when you're getting into homomorphic or differential privacy, you're getting into the point where the critical question is, what else can I use that data for? That's the critical question, because everybody knows that you can use the data generally to provide exactly the service that they bought, for example. But can you use it for other things? Can you use it to develop your next product? Can you use it to develop a better customer experience? Can you use it to advertise broadly or for other uses? And one of the critical things we've seen there is a lot of that information that you need to make those judgments right now is almost impossible to abstract from a machine. You can't see, for example, and know all of the acceptable uses right now by just looking at a document or a machine. It's more ambiguous and it's not readable. And so we've seen a pretty big movement right now from in phase 1, phase 2, as opposed to phase 3 yet, Aaron, Andrew, Mome, to some of the points you were making, on just being able to connect your data governance solutions and enrich it with all of the other information so you can make better decisions about how to use your data. And how do you pull the information from your data governance side over into your compliance side so you're not doing the same exercise twice. That's baseline for us right now in many, many enterprises. So maybe we can pick up that discussion in a moment, just because really privacy is focused at its base on making sure that you treat the data from a person in a way that they expected it to be treated fundamentally. Like when they gave you the data, they expected it to be used for one purpose. Are you using it for anything else, or is it being accessed for any other purpose? And a lot of these technology issues that we've been tackling in a hard way are in some ways also require some manual process right now, because it's hard to abstract the information directly from the machines themselves. But if I may then pivot over to Mome, on this question of really interesting technologies, are there ones you'd like to add into the conversation, Mome?
I think you touched on a lot of areas that we can go down. I would say, Aaron and Andrew, you guys talked a lot about the cutting edge technologies. Maybe I will talk a little bit about what you just mentioned, Justin, at the intersection of those technologies, as well as the business models that we'll be seeing, and how I think where privacy is going is becoming more all-encompassing in terms of how do you use the data in other places, how do you get coordinated efforts across departments. But I think the reason we're seeing so many point solutions today is that it's hard, right? There's so much that you need to cover that when you are one company, especially if you are an early stage company that depends on rounds of venture funding to continue, you can't really tackle everything at once on one platform and expect everything to be fully vetted from day one. So that's why we're seeing all these point solutions around handling one area, whether it's encryption, whether it's customer data deletion, whether it's giving consumers access, or maybe they're going more broad in terms of function, but they're only targeting healthcare, or they're only targeting data from connected cars. No company really goes out there to venture investors or otherwise and says, I want to be a point solution. I think that's really just the entry point of where can I really leverage my competitive advantage to gain the trust, all the things that we talked about, to gain the trust of the customer, so then I can sell them more of my products, so that I can then go across departments at these organizations and begin to get my tentacles into other areas of data, including data governance or other ways of using it. I think another dynamic that you will see related is that you might have some combination of software and services. I think for VC investors particularly, but generally, we all love the idea of just having a self-serve software that you can just drop off and leave, and then it generates recurring revenue, and then you're done. But in an emerging and evolving sector like privacy, a lot of the times you don't need the full hand-holding like a consulting firm or a services firm needs to, but you need to evolve with your customer, grow with your customer, help them use your solution, introduce them to new functions that you will inevitably be adding to it. And that's how you ensure like an ongoing, continuous customer success. So I think that's just a couple of comments I would make on the business models in addition to the technologies that Aaron and Andrew talked about.
Well, that's a really interesting perspective, and I think it resonates with a lot of us listening, Mome, because it is an early complex problem. Do you mind if I ask, just as part of this, all of us are working with large and small companies, and we have tech teams and IT teams who are using the latest technologies often. We mentioned this even when we were all chatting the other day. it'd be interesting for our community to hear from you about what are some technologies that the development teams, the engineers, the most innovative people in our companies and the CPOs companies are going to be using themselves that might affect the company's view on privacy itself. Like, for example, quantum computing is now productized. We were talking about this the other day. There are companies offering quantum computing capacity as a service that has at least the potential to undermine existing encryption technologies if they're being used. So, Aaron, you may have a view on this. Obviously, your NEA has an investment in one of the early, important quantum companies. But are there is it quantum or other technologies that you all see being maybe coming to market that we should be paying attention to as a privacy community?
I think quantum is going to be super disruptive. But that being said, I see it as a decade, if not multiple decade development before we're actually seeing it used at scale for real world applications. I can't say that any of our current portfolio is actually running quantum computing applications. There's a lot of experimentation going on, but for quantum computing to be impactful, it needs to get to a place of a certain amount of qubits, and we still have a ways to go before we actually see it operating at the sophistication to make an impact. And I also think that what's good about quantum computing is actually the quantum encryption is already known and happens to actually be ahead of quantum computing. So even if quantum computing does take off, fortunately, there are some mathematically provable ways of doing encryption that even if you had the world's most powerful quantum computer, you couldn't break it. And so that gives me comfort that all our data or all of our cryptocurrency one day isn't suddenly going to be go to zero because people have been able to break all the existing hash and password technologies. I think the near-term technologies that we're seeing companies use to have an edge is really machine learning. It's how do I do large-scale machine learning through Spark on top of one of our actual portfolio companies, Databricks, just to do models that scale on petabytes of data. And it's not just building the models, it's how do I build the models and then deploy those in production so that if a consumer comes to my website, I have a pretty sophisticated model and I can analyze them and personalize the website or the experience so they get the highest chance of converting or buying on my website. And some of our most cutting edge companies, the advantage is really all in the model. It's they figure out a way to get access to data and then train and run the model in real time. And that's the company. So that's really where I think the near-term impact is going to be. The big companies that embrace AI, that's where you're going to get a ton of value from your data. Quantum computing is something you should pay attention to. But in the near term, it's probably more science fiction. The medium to long term, that's when you'll actually start to be able to write real-world applications.
Andrew, Eric, maybe Monet?
Sure, I would, I touched on this a little bit in passing in one of the earlier questions, but I see a lot of potential around maybe not necessarily a specific technology around quantum computing, but different efforts to just analyze massive amounts of data. So we have a company called OC that's doing this, and they're doing innovations around hardware and software in order to achieve this level of processing. And so we talked to some of their customers, and a lot of the fintech firms, for example, we heard one anecdote that they had 16 years of bull market data across 200 exchanges across the world. So anytime their customers ask them for any data, they literally pull it onto a USB drive and mail it to them. And so there's got to be a more efficient way of analyzing that data in real time and faster. And I would say we see this a lot also in different sectors. So for example, in the ad tech space, a lot of these companies need to figure out how to spend $1 million over 2 weeks, how to test scenarios with over 100 switches and dials. And that's not something that you can easily do. So underlying this again is privacy, but kind of adjacent to that is just what do you do with the massive amounts of real-time data they need to analyze? And we're seeing a lot of cool technologies, again, innovations, not just on software, but hardware in conjunction with software that enables the companies to do that.
Yeah, look, I think everyone on the panel has really outlined some really interesting cutting edge technologies that will be leading us forward. And I get excited about those. I also get excited though about, some of the existing technologies and new use cases that we're finding for them that relate to privacy. And I'll give just one example. I had a conversation with a company the other day that's in data security and specifically has capabilities around rights management. So essentially data-centric security, tying the security directly to the data itself. And, it's a technology that's been around for a decade, maybe more. But with privacy becoming such a driver in purchasing decisions, what they're finding is the ability to attach security directly to the data, and then importantly have centralized auditing and tracking of the data flow really helps its customers be compliant with a whole host of regulations across the privacy landscape. And they're seeing this as a big driver of new business and repeat upsell business with existing customers. And so, why that gets important, that gets interesting to me as a banker is, as I think about companies that may already be well established, have good customer bases, and other companies that may also be looking to expand their own capabilities, there are companies out there today that could be ripe for acquisition, ripe for later stage investment that are answering questions and use cases, in the year 2021, where we don't have to wait another 5 or 7 years for these to come to market. So there's a lot out there that I think can be, fit to answer some of these pressing needs.
Andrew, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, maybe just a reflection, Justin, and it's one observation of what moves markets forward. How do you get progress and what drives innovation? And oftentimes, there are these interesting use cases, whether, as Eric's pointed out, an established technology that finds a new use case. I think we're seeing some of that, certainly in privacy. And so, it's nice sometimes to think about these very highly technical emerging solutions that may be 2, 3, 5 years down the road when it comes to building a market. But what's in the market today and what's actually driving that pull? And oftentimes it is chief privacy officers at a large organization who are saying, look, I don't have the headcount, I don't have the budget to do this all by hand. We need to automate this and do this process more efficiently. And that's often that challenge set then says or forces this conversation of how do these individuals work with WireWheel or work with kind of, in this broader sense of data governance and the different categories around data security that some of us have mentioned. One of the primary challenges too that we've seen organizations talk about is, look, the growth in data, while an opportunity, is not growing in line with, say, customers. For example, we talked to one person and said, look, our customer, for every 2x in customers we have, our growth in data is 7x. So our trend is going in the wrong direction. And it's not because they're unable to unlock business value out of the growth in data, but because now it introduces more risk, more complexity. And you see that across now unstructured data stores, and you see that across just figuring out and minimizing the data that you do have if you are a privacy-centric brand. And so there's a lot of these now individuals are saying, okay, how do we work with companies like WireWheel, become maybe a design partner, maybe an early customer, feed the early pipeline for innovative technologies and actually move this market forward. And it's those early adopters that are really starting to pull and signal to their own peers that, look, the market really is ripe for disruption here. And there are software solutions that can allow a much more painstaking or pains-free rather approach to the business function, especially for managing privacy, or certainly in data security and the data engineering and data privacy side.
I knew we were going to get here, but we're almost out of time. We're down to the last few minutes, and I want to at least pull one question from the audience, if you don't mind, to run by you all, and maybe we can then wrap it up with any final remarks from our panelists here today. But one question I might run by you all from our audience: both employee data privacy management and consumer-facing data privacy platforms seem like the next logical waves in privacy tech, especially as zero trust tools emerge? Do you see one or both making a large leap? And if so, when? Any reaction from the panelists?
Yeah, maybe Justin, I'll keep my comments brief on this one, but I think that's an observation, a keen observation too, because a couple times now the panelists have talked about analogies or parallels between other markets. And let me make another parallel here between security and privacy, in that, when you see the B2B penetration in the security market, really a lot of the market activity is 95% B2B and 5% B2C. But what I do think you're going to see in privacy is, because there is so much consumer interest here, there really is a gap for consumers to be able to manage their own data flows. And rather than force consumers to go to dozens or even hundreds of different companies in which they may suspect their data resides and then request that data to be deleted, you're going to see some of that be automated on the consumer side. And once that occurs, you're going to see, say, the DSAR requests really pick up for organizations, and in many cases even be flooded, because just like in security, if I had to go and find my own VPN provider, my own antivirus, manage it on my own, maybe a password protector, there's a lot of great quality organizations now that have bundled those services, and it's really meant that you've seen that growth really take off. And of course, there's established players too. You think NortonLifeLock, and you think about the lucrative business that they have just created in the consumer space, and how it's fueled to, pre the Symantec split, a lot of the innovation that they were able to do on the enterprise side.
Andrew, that's a great answer. I appreciate it. I don't know if there anybody else want to add anything here for a moment.
So, not to have too contrarian a view, and I do largely agree with that, and all the polls do talk about consumers caring about privacy. I cited one at the outset here. I do though wonder, if that's a business model that will work. I mean, clearly consumers care about their privacy. All things being equal, they would prefer data privacy over not. But are they willing to pay for it? Will they demand that? I think that remains to be seen. So if I were positioning solutions, I certainly would want to be more on the B2B or the enterprise side than one that's consumer focused. Just as I think about where we are today, and drawing a parallel to cybersecurity for one, adjacent market.
Thanks, everybody. I can see Camille's calling us to the end of the session.
I can't.
A phenomenal discussion, I can tell you, today, and really helpful to the community in a lot of ways to bring your perspective. Mome, Eric, Andrew, Aaron, thanks so much for your time and sharing it with us today. And I hope we'll see you at our next spokes in person. We're hoping here in the next couple of months. So thank you again, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Justin.
We're looking forward.